Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Diaspora Chronicles. My name is Muchelemba, and I am the founder of Ongolo.com, a Pan-African website whose main objective is to keep Africans connected and engaged and to promote Africa and Africans. On today's program, I'm joined by 4 of the 5 editors of Afronomicslaworg, a blog that focuses on the international economic law landscape as it relates to Africa and the Global South. The 5th editor, Ntope Mapefane, could not be with us today, but she will be represented by her colleagues in this 2-part interview. The first part of the interview, I'll invite Professor James Gathii and Dr. Olabisi Akinkugbe to talk about Afronomicslaw.org. In part 2, I'll invite Dr. Titilayo Adebola and Dr. Omiunu to talk about intellectual property and contract law. So I'm delighted to now welcome onto the program Bisi and James to talk about Afronomics law. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Muloongo, for having us.
Thank you for agreeing to come. So I'm just going to get up your logo out real quick, and then we'll get started. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the program and talk about your fantastic blog. So I thought we'd start by actually doing a quick intro and letting people know a little bit about yourselves. James?
Great. Well, I'll start. So I am James Gathii. I was born and brought up in Kenya, went to the University of Nairobi. At the end of the Cold War, went to study at Harvard Law School, where I got my master's and my PhD. And after about 20 years, I'm now teaching at Loyola University in Chicago, School of Law, as a professor of law, and I hold a chair there. Most of my work is about Africa. I work in both public international law and in international economic law, and I travel back and forth quite a bit, as we shall be talking about in this episode.
Fantastic. And Bisi?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Muloongo, for this interview today. I am Olabisi Akinkugbe. I'm a Nigerian, and I did my undergraduate studies in law at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. Before then, proceeding to undertake masters at the University of Toronto in Canada, and after a brief stint back at work in Nigeria, returned for PhD at University of Ottawa, where the journey of life has taken me to then teaching at universities in Canada. Now I teach at Dalhousie University, Schulich School of Law in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I also research on issues of international economic law as they relate to Africa, but also international law and development. And these issues really form the fulcrum of things that I'm interested in.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into the meat of the discussion and just hear from you about what inspired you to actually launch Afronomicslaw.org.
Yes, so we launched Afronomics Law in January of 2019. And the reason that we launched it was because on the issues we care most about, which are the issues of international economic justice relating to Africa, there were very few forums where academics like ourselves and policymakers, particularly those in Africa, where there's a very active scene in issues of international economic justice and international economic law, could interact. And so leveraging the technology, we initiated this blog to bridge that gap. And also because a lot of the narrative about international economic law and international economic justice in Africa and in the Global South has been controlled from the West. The narratives are controlled by the World Bank, the IMF, by other global institutions like the WTO that have a lot of money in terms of research, in terms of outreach, and also by Western academics who control the way in which Africa is seen and regarded, and the Global South as well. And so a primary goal of the blog, which also has a journal coming up, and we shall talk about that, is to take charge of those narratives and reconfigure them so that they are more centered on Africa and African interests and interests of the global South, so that we don't always yield to Western academics, to Western institutions about how they define our issues, whether it's about sovereign debt, whether it's about sub-regional integration in East Africa or in Southern Africa or in Central Africa or in any other part of Africa, whether it's in terms of important issues like we are discussing now in the COVID-19 era, like sovereign debt and the role of creditors. We want to shine a light on all those issues from the perspective that matters most to the people of Africa and of the global South.
Fantastic.
Yeah. If I could just add, I think James has said it very well. The other part is to put the searchlight on many people who do this work on the continent of Africa and elsewhere in global South that do not really get, their day in mainstream, right? So they produce these works and it's as if they're talking to themselves, whereas putting them in conversation with those who have been in the mainstream, it forms another core goal of the blog.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to that, I think the point that Bisi is making is very important, which is that the voices of developing countries in general are quite marginalized in the way we think about international economic governance in general. If we go back to the 1970s, to the era of the new international economic order, which was driven mostly by countries of the global South, including Africa in the driver's seat, the narrative about those instances of trying to reform and review international economic governance so that we can have a full accounting of the structure of international economic governance that is grounded in the history. For example, the history of colonialism, the history of slavery, as important factors that structure what we have today, is not a discussion that you often see. And so one of the primary goals of this blog and the voices that we publish every day and the interactions we have is to change the narrative by harnessing the best knowledge, as Bisi is saying, the best research out there that is often invisible, that is not part of the dominant narratives that is controlled from elsewhere.
That's great. And I think that's a good introduction. It's really about giving visibility to the work that's being done on the continent, from people from the continent. And that's really actually one of the reasons why I founded Ongolo as well. So I'm really glad that we connected and can have this shared movement to bring visibility in African issues. So what are your objectives? So for people watching this and wondering, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Could you just help us elaborate on that?
So we have several objectives. Some of the most immediate ones that there's a lot on international economic governance that is happening on the continent that we would like to connect as many people as possible to be involved in those discussions and debates about how to center those options on the priorities for Africa. So for example, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, a very important initiative by the African Union to bring together African states to trade more with each other. African states trade much more easily with North America, with Canada, with Europe than they trade with each other. And that's just simply not acceptable. So we think the discussions going on around issues such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement should be issues that involve not just the states, the African states, but all sorts of stakeholders, the academics like ourselves, the policy makers, people in civil society, the private sector. And the blog has really done a great job on any of the themes that are covered by the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to bring these people together, whether it's on intellectual property rights that you discuss in the second part of this, whether it's on issues of competition law, whether it's on issues on international investment law. All those are really important issues, but have often been framed from the perspective of what the WTO is, the World Trade Organization, or other Western controlled international organizations. So our goal is to, one of our primary goals is to be able to influence how we think about those things and to center, hopefully influence to center the discussion so they focus on the priorities of Africa. So just to give one very concrete example, we can give many examples. One of the largest parts of African trade is informal cross-border trade. But that is one of the most repressed parts of trade on the continent. And so we've done a lot on the blog to highlight those types of issues that are really of a high priority for African trade. Another is agriculture. Agriculture is the mainstay of African economies. Unfortunately, the international economic rules, for example, those of the World Trade Organization, are structured in a way that give preference to manufacturing and industrial goods over agriculture. The West subsidizes agriculture very heavily. So, for example, in West Africa, we find people there are more likely to be drinking powder milk from Europe rather than fresh milk produced by their neighbors. And these are the consequences of the structure of global trade rules that we would like to expose and to recenter the discussions so that there's more transparency in the debates at the African Union. And we can call on the African Union if they are structuring the deals in such a way as to focus on the advantages for the West and not for Africa, and particularly those that are most vulnerable. So I think that's a good illustration, but I'm sure Bisi can give more examples about the types of things we are doing, because I think they're the ones that best illustrate our objectives.
So forgive my ignorance, but the example on agriculture is a fantastic one, because agriculture is one of the topics that I'm following quite closely, because Africa does have the potential to feed the world. So it sounds, I'm amazed it's a law, it's a legal, there's a legal angle to this. I thought it was just trade, negotiation, and economics. Like, just help me understand, like, so people watching this to be like, oh, it's a bunch of lawyers. So how is the legal framework actually disadvantaging Africa in the agriculture sector? Like, just elaborate a bit on that, because I'm really fascinated.
Okay, so Bisi, let me just give one example. I mean, I think the most dramatic example for how global trade rules disadvantage African economies is the ability of Western economies to subsidize their agriculture. So, for example, in Europe, under the Common Agricultural Policy, here in the United States, and a variety of programs where the government can, every 5 years in the United States, under what is known as the Farm Bill, give billions of US dollars to farmers that make cotton, for example, particularly cheap on the global market. You know, so for an American farmer, they produce cotton at more than $1 a pound. In West and Central Africa, cotton is produced at about 20 cents a pound. But guess what cotton is found on the global markets? Guess Muloongo.
American.
I ask my students, where do you think the cotton that's made the clothes you're wearing right now, or that I'm wearing right now, where do you think that cotton was made? It was grown.
In the US?
More likely than not, I can bet 99.9% in the United States, because the government has paid farmers to grow the cotton. Whereas farmers in West Africa and in Central Africa, who are producing cotton at the most, the lowest cost, cannot find a market for their cotton, because the global trade rules are structured in a way that makes it possible for the United States or for Europe to subsidize their farmers. Now, if Kenya or Zambia or Nigeria or any other African country wanted to subsidize their farmers, they would do it sector by sector, say to the cotton farmers. Under the rules of the WTO, that would be illegal, because the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement makes it illegal for subsidies that are sector specific. So, as an economist once argued, you know, the development ladder has been kicked away from us. We can't really do the same things the West has been able to do. And when the West subsidizes, they subsidize across an entire, not just an entire sector, they subsidize the whole of agriculture. in a way that would not be legal under the rules. And so the rules, in effect, were written in a way that advantages them and disadvantages us.
Wow.
So those are the types of things that make the work we do on this blog and the academic work that we'd like to make visible really important. Because at the moment in the WTO, the current discussions about the future direction of global trade doesn't give these types of issues a priority. So it's up to us, the Africans, the people of the global South, to create the right narrative, to be critical of the current structure of rules, to wonder why it is that even toothpicks in an African economy come from the West, like we have no forests. Yeah. So those are the types of issues that we are really interested and really motivate and really sort of behind why we think a conversation like this is very important.
Fantastic, and it's interesting because the WTO DG role is up for grabs, and we've got 2 candidates from Africa, and the window closes next week. So I'm actually profiling the 2 African candidates. So I think this is a really good opportunity for not only someone from the global South, particularly from Africa, to come in, but to try and fix some of these things that your blog is doing a fantastic job at shedding light on. Bisi, you were going to come in on some of the key successes off the back of what James has said. So what people will be curious to know, what have you highlighted? What do you consider some of your successes thus far?
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think James and a lot of important points in those interventions, but let me highlight 2 additional ones. Mm-hmm. I think that part of what the blog seeks to do is to emerge from the continent of Africa and project the world. So that means we're not insular in what we do. A core aim of the blog is to really get scholarship from a diverse group of people, right? So scholars, policymakers, NGO activists, and put them in conversation, not only with Western scholars, but also other global South countries. So for example, you will see on the blog, we don't just have contributing editors from different parts of Africa alone, but we also have some now from, say, Latin America. Why is that important? It is important because, as you were saying in the context of agriculture a short while ago, the narrative and structure of power that really puts down, right, raw materials and primary goods is not just skewed against Africa. It is one that has impacts and ramifications beyond the African continent. And as such, we are very, even though one is modest about it, glad that over the past 18 months, we've been able to galvanize interests, not just on the continent, but also outside of the continent. You know, to speak to people in Latin America, in Chile, for example, or in, Uruguay, to learn what they are doing and to see how academics can be in conversation with each other, and then maybe gradually go down to NGOs. So let me give a more concrete example. James has talked about the webinars we're doing. The second one we had was on vulnerability in trade and investment in the context of COVID-19. And an outcome of that webinar, for example, is a written symposium. Now, that written symposium has scholars writing on it, but it also has NGO and activists from not just Africa, but Latin America and Europe. And I think this is important to be able to put all this audience together in conversation on one platform and learn from each other. Of course, the Caribbean is there. We must not forget. Is that an important part of this narrative that we need to bring together? So that's one. The second one I like to highlight is also just the sheer breadth of people who write. It's easy to think the job of writing is for academics alone. And when we think about academics, I think we all come to writing with a bit of, we know how to do it, but sometimes a bit of, we are not sure whether what we've written would really fly out there. So we've seen graduate students who write and their blogs just pick up. And people are Westerners and Africans and people all around the world are engaging with these ideas. You cannot put price and value on the importance of the confidence that those kind of scholars in graduate programs get from that kind of writing that is out there. And of course, excellence is what guides all this. So we are there to also make sure that we provide this platform as a nurturing one. It's inclusive in that regard. The goal is not to say the writing that a certain person has done is below a particular standard. We don't have a definition of excellence other than to say that we submit it to the rigor of the editors and we provide feedback to you to make sure this is the best possible work that you put out there.
That's great. And actually, there's a question here about the platform. So so Demba is someone who featured on my program. He's from Senegal, works in the US, and actually helps small-scale farmers in Senegal and Mali on improving agriculture productivity. So he featured on my program. So he's asking a question about a platform dedicated to furthering the fight for better visibility of African issues. And to that, Demba, I've just put a note saying, please subscribe on Afronomicslaw.org. Because I think it's important that we don't have so many blogs and platforms mushrooming around when we've got, you know, centers of excellence, and we should work together as much as possible. So, I mean, thanks for highlighting some of the work that you're doing. So how can people actually get involved in what the work that you're trying to do?
If I could just make one more point.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, James, before you go, I think it's important to highlight something you've said, Muloongo, that, you know, we formed this blog, and it's written in the about section of the blog that we don't pride ourselves as the first persons doing this, right? So at the time we came on board, we acknowledged that there are other fora, you know, that are existent, and we are complementing that. So I think it's important to think about the strength we have in collaboration, and we have done that in a lot of the work we do. We collaborate with different organizations, different blogs across the globe to really produce content that is nuanced and centers the voice of various regions at the end of the day. So I think it's important to highlight that as well.
Okay. James, you were going to say something.
So thanks, Bisi. I mean, in response to your question, how people can get involved, I mean, there are so many ways that the way that we've organized the blog, that people could get involved. So if you've written a book that focuses on any issue relating to international economic governance, not just law in Africa, we can help you organize a symposium to discuss your book. Because one of the things that is really frustrating to those of us that work in this area is the lack of visibility of the ideas that are produced by both academics and policymakers, because most of the publishing houses may not necessarily be interested in these types of issues, or when they publish our books, they're too expensive to be on the shelves of an African university library. So we've had really, if you go to our blog and you'll see the symposia tab, if you look at the book symposia, we have some of the most extensive book symposia that you'd ever have anywhere, much better than some of the leading journals. And I can say that because I sit on some of those editorial boards. People really engage with those ideas. We get about 5 people to engage with those ideas. We publicize the symposium, the book symposium, on all our social media platforms, and we've got very good reception. So that's one important way you can get involved. The other is if you can suggest themes that you think should be covered by a blog like this, or if you'd like to collaborate with us, like Professor Akinkugbe has said, there's a lot of scope for creativity and innovation, and most importantly for me, and I guess for us on the blog, is networking. This opportunity to be able to speak to your audience, Muloongo, is an example of that. We want to be able to galvanize the people who are passionate and committed to these issues in a way that is possible now in 2020. It wasn't possible when I first became a graduate student because we didn't have all this technology. A lot of the platforms that in our field that were concerned about these issues were controlled in the West. So now the responsibility is on all of us. And like in my view, the first generation of people that came from where we came from, the scholars who didn't network, who didn't work together, who didn't collaborate as effectively. And I think that the responsibility lies squarely on us to figure out ways in which we could leverage all our various strengths across disciplines, across the countries, across all these themes, so that we can talk in one voice, even though we may not always agree, in a way that will counter the dominant narratives that come from the West. The West is very organized. They know exactly what they want. Right now, the United States knows what it wants. It wants to negotiate a free trade agreement with Kenya. I'm not sure, I'm Kenyan, I'm not sure the Kenyan government knows what it wants. And it's really the academics or the civil society groups that have really been running up front and making those issues visible. And, we are working on such issues because we think that having more transparency is better than not.
So we've actually got a question. I'm going to paraphrase this because it's quite long. So Andrew is watching from Nairobi, and he's asked a question which is not coming on entirely on the screen, but I think it's linked to the point that you mentioned, James, earlier about how the U.S. is able to get around its agriculture subsidies and without violating WTO agreements. And he's talking about, the full question is, he's talking about selling of finished products rather than raw materials. So Africa is known for selling raw materials, and he's advocating, why can we sell more finished products? And is there something about legislation that's currently preventing us from doing so, or violate any legislation if we change our exports to finished rather than raw materials? Is there anything, any comment on that?
Yes, definitely. So thanks, Andrew, for that question. It's a very good question. So let's start at home. Charity begins at home. Kenya had the opportunity to ban the importation of secondhand clothes as a commitment of the East African Community States. Kenya reneged on that commitment. If Kenya wants to have a viable textile manufacturing sector, ban secondhand clothes. I think the only reason that Kenya is thinking about banning secondhand clothes is because of COVID-19. Eventually, the government, I think, came around to that. Rwanda was very clear from the beginning. Rwanda banned the importation of secondhand clothes to make sure that it has a viable manufacturing sector. Kenya refused to do that because it wanted to have continued access to the US market. So a lot of trade is about options. You might think that it's better to have access to the US market for a couple of things, but you sacrifice an entire industry like the textile industry because you don't want to do what is necessary to support your industrialization policy, your manufacturing capability. So that's a really dramatic example that countries make choices and choices have consequences. And I think that if African countries really want to get manufacturing to work for them, they should look to what South Africa is doing. South Africa not only bans secondhand clothes, it bans importation of secondhand clothes from abroad. It also bans secondhand cars because it has a very huge car industry. The other thing we know about South Africa is the labor unions are very powerful. And there's a long legacy in the anti-apartheid struggle with the power of the labor industry. The government has been under a lot of pressure from the labor movement in South Africa to enact these policies. So if we really want to have manufacturing capability, if we want to manufacture things to export to the West, our governments have to just do the right thing and not just listen to the importers. The importers often have too much power over government policy. And I think that the example we're about to see with Kenya negotiating this free trade agreement with the US, where the government has already given up concessions on wheat, which is a main crop in Kenya and could be a major export, is another example of an African government shooting its foot. What do we say? Shooting itself on its foot.
Yeah.
So I think that Africa doesn't lack in plans. There are lots of plans. People know exactly what to do. We have a very capable industrialization minister in Kenya, like in many African countries. But I think that they have to be able to work in a way that speaks back to the West to promote their interests and not just to cave in to pressure from the West or pressure from domestic interest groups that want to bring in everything. I mean, last example, it's very frustrating. I go to any African country, you can get almost anything on in an African supermarket or, you know, in the African market space. Here in the West, I live in Chicago, I can't get as much variety as I can in Kenya. And part of the reason is that we just opened our borders in a way that is really inexplicable to me. We don't care about our own producers. We don't fund our own producers the way the West does. So anyway, I could go on forever about this.
No, but it's a really valid point. I think we should talk about real issues, live issues, because then people will start to appreciate, you know, what exactly we can do better. So if you were talking to President Uhuru Kenyatta today, what would you advise him to do to make sure that Kenya actually wins from these negotiations? So you've said we've given up on wheat, which is not great. But what should we do to get the best for Kenya in this deal?
If I could give an example before Professor Gathii goes, then we come back to him. Because I think that he has, as he said, and I think we can go on and on today talking a lot about it, and not to move on at all. He will respond to that question. But I think it's interesting to complement his very practical examples with the Nigerian context in relation to the importation of rice, for example, and tomatoes, canned tomatoes, or turkey, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole list over time that the Nigerian government has banned, you know, importation of products. And the most recent relates to rice. Nigerians love their rice, right? So the ongoing battle about jollof rice and so on between Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria, which we shouldn't start here. But there's a huge market of producers as well of local rice. And that pitches the government in a very unusual position, because there are vested interests that make so much profit from importation of rice from Thailand, from whichever place in the world that these goods come into the country. But there's also the issue of how much it takes to get the products into the Nigerian market directly, such that it may come into Nigeria through Benin, the Cotonou border, right? Mm-hmm. And the politics of, you know, closing the border in Nigeria, for example, against the importation of those kind of products, it's a big one. So at one level, which is the issue of how these countries position themselves vis-a-vis international community in the negotiation of free trade agreements. But the other part of it is also how they have to deal with the local economy, right? Private sector who wants to develop industries in rice production in Nigeria, you know, union bodies who say, yeah, we think the farmers can do this, and we need to put their own products on the table for buyers to really get, but also how expensive it is for the everyday people, you know, to bear with the market, with the farmers for a short time before they get up to speed to even, and the price starts to drop vis-a-vis the ones that import. So I think if we put these other issues in a bucket, then maybe Professor Gathii can respond to how, to the unique positions our governments find themselves in making choices.
Yeah. So, I just think, as Bisi is saying, we have to think, what is the right model for us to trade with the West? The model that the West, especially the United States, would like to trade with us is the model that fits their interest best. The model that works for us is one that centers development, one that centers the development of our manufacturing capability, that leverages the advantages we have in agriculture so that we can move up in the value chains, so that we are not just exporting the cocoa, or, you know, in West Africa, or the coffee beans in Kenya without any kind of processing. When I look at the interests that are lining up here in the United States to take advantage of the US-Kenya Free Trade Agreement, I worry very much for Kenya. As many people have said, we are going to be put through the meat grinder because the US has a template. It has an agreement that says, sign here. And there isn't much flexibility in that template. And that template is written by US industry, whether it is on intellectual property rights, whether it's on investment. Now, Kenya is banking. The theory, Kenya is banking that there's going to be a lot of foreign direct investment that's going to come from this free trade agreement. But all the empirical research shows that no country benefits from foreign direct investment without the prerequisites of leveraging that foreign direct investment. So if you don't have the infrastructure, the stable energy supply, the roads, and the costs of production are not very high, this is not going to make a difference. And so I think that the priorities in terms of getting this free trade agreement may in principle be a good idea, but the details in terms of how this is going to be executed may be highly disadvantageous for Kenya, unless Kenya is being promised, which I don't see any so far, a different model for how to do trade with the United States. The only region in Africa that has rejected this kind of a template free trade agreement is the Southern Africa Customs Union, SACU. A few years ago, the US brought the agreement and said, here's the agreement, sign here. And the Southern Africa Customs Union walked away, primarily because at the time, there was a question of access to essential medicines, and the rules there in terms of allowing access to essential medicines to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic were weighted against South Africa and the Southern African states. So I think the stakes for Kenya is the US going to put Kenya through the meat grinder, the template FTA, the template free trade agreement that it sort of signs with every economy? Or is there going to be a different template that puts integration in terms of, that puts development at the center, that prioritizes different needs, especially for Kenya as an economy that is vastly smaller, without the kind of leverage. And I wouldn't say this has nothing to do with lack of expertise in terms of negotiating. That's not the issue. The issue is that the interest groups that are lining up on the side of the United States government are very effective in getting what they want in agreement after agreement. And why should Kenya be different if Kenya is going to especially be negotiating on its own without the ability to negotiate with other countries so that they can counterbalance the power of the United States? In terms also of considering how does this relate to our integration agenda on the continent, in terms of undermining the commitments of the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement, in terms of the priorities in the East African community. So I'm not sure that that what Kenya is being offered is what Kenya is saying it's going to get when you look at the details. And I'm not sure that this is the right time to do it. Perhaps maybe we should wait for a new administration after November. This president has said things about Africa which are not very, just let's say, good. So I'm not sure that their interests are where I would like them to be. And we know that this president is also captured by private interests that are likely to drive that free trade agenda in the wrong direction. So I think I've said more than enough here.
No, but it's a really interesting point. And it goes back to, I mean, last week when I talked about why I founded Ongolo and why I'm Pan-African, is because Africa is strong when Africa is united. When you've got a market of 1.3 billion people and 54, 55 countries, depending on how you treat Western Sahara. But we need to be united, and that's the only way we have bargaining power. So why is Kenya doing this alone? Where is the role of the AU or COMESA or the East Africa community? If SACU can say no, and SACU is South Africa, Swaziland, Lesotho, I think, and maybe Namibia. I can't remember if Namibia is.
Yeah,
if they have the power of telling the US to walk, why is Kenya doing this alone?
I mean, I think
it's a good question.
It's a good question, and I don't think it's a question anybody would pretend to have the answers to it all. But what is core is this: is that the idea that African countries come together under the framework of Pan-Africanism. Let's just assume that it means one thing for the purpose of this conversation, right? That we want to have an African Continental Free Trade Area agreement that puts us in a very powerful position to negotiate and therefore start effecting change to the international economic structure that favors us. If we have that, it takes a whole lot more than the political celebrations of signing these agreements to stand behind those commitments, right? And this is where, as James talks about, the details matter. And I mean, you can think about this one in the context of interests for each country. Quite apart from this, you can look at the European Union's trade agreement, right, which they signed with Europe, Pacific and African countries. That's another dimension of how powerful organized Western interests, if you like, fragments, our interest and puts divisive lines in there. So this already almost undermines a potentially restructuring agenda at the moment. And so it's not new that we see an organized West either through the US and not necessarily in conversation with other countries, but they're just pursuing their own interests. And they can do so because of the power that they control, economy-wise, resource-wise. And those private interests bringing their interests to bear on the government and pursuing it. We haven't seen enough of that on the African continent. I mean, Nigeria, for example, delayed signing the AfCFTA, as did South Africa, two big economies. So you do have to question why an economy such as Nigeria grandstands in the face of the AfCFTA, and then pitch that against why maybe Kenya, despite its own national issue, says we want to go alone on this issue. So you see, it becomes much more complex once you move the politics aside to the national economic interest, which unfortunately, for the purpose of achieving developmental goals in the integration context that we want, we must really find a way to come together to push that as a continent.
So these are kind of issues you discuss, on the blog in detail. Is this what's going to feature in the journal? So we're going to talk about the journal that's going to be launched in the fall.
I'll let James go.
Yes, we are really excited about this journal. Yeah, so we are really excited about this journal. It's the voices that you hear in this journal will really center African issues, and in the level of detail that we've been discussing today. So we have, for example, an excellent article relating trade to gender. In the African context, we have an excellent article that talks about the issues of competition law, because that's a very big issue in African trade that often is not part of the discussion. We are unearthing all these very important cases decided by these sub-regional courts in East Africa, like the East African Community, in the Southern African Development Community, and elsewhere, so that we can, with just those examples, also reforms of international investment law throughout the continent, so that we can have African voices talking about African issues on our own terms, in our own journal that's going to be available for everybody for free. So it's the standards are world-class standards. We are editing to the same level of any journal anywhere. It's a labor of love, but it's really, very fulfilling. We'll make this freely accessible online, so that we can go around some of the hoops that are erected around access to knowledge and knowledge production. So this is one, but there are going to be many others that follow. We are trying to connect all sorts of issues. Another, maybe we can talk another day, is on tax justice, an important symposium coming up on tax justice. As you know, African countries pay much more money to Western creditors and to other interests than we receive ever in any foreign aid. And so that's one of the major issues that we're going to be sort of addressing, both in a symposium, but also in a future issue of the journal. So lots coming up on the pages, both of the blog and of the journal.
What I really like about your blog, by the way, is how timely your articles are. So you did an article on the Malawi elections. We've just had a new president sworn in. You had a fantastic article on COVID-19. And as somebody actually who's watching from Madagascar, and I had featured an economist talking about the Madagascar COVID cure, and I saw, the discussion about the IP and traditional medicine. So your blog is really timely, and that's something that's fantastic to see, because a lot of times our publications tend to be outdated. So people need to come onto the blog as often as possible to see what your thoughts are on various topical issues. So we're coming up to the end of part one. So any closing remarks from both of you before I invite on Ohio and Titi.
If for 2 minutes I could say something.
Sure.
I think that again, it's important to share with your audience here and every other person who may watch this that the journal will open up not just to Africans to submit, right, to people from all around the world, and as you said, the way it maps onto the blog. The blog is not also just about us, the editors, right? We see ourselves doing this in a position of trust from the community that we serve. And as James has said, it's a labor of love. So we welcome, well-written, well-researched pieces that we provide feedback on, and then will be published. There is no other agenda other than to have a platform that puts everybody in conversation. So they will read not just us, but many other fantastic scholars across the world. And I think for me, before I pass the baton to James, is to say there's much more that is going on, and this is a platform from everybody, for everybody. It's a labor of love that's not just about the editors, but also the writers and the readers. And those components need to come together to be able to really galvanize the ideas that people share and engage with them, and hopefully get it in the hands of those that matter for policy decision. The name of the blog I see is Afronomics Law, and you can easily get to it at www.afronomicslaw.org.
So, I have nothing else to add. I think Bisi has said it all. Thank you so much, Muloongo, for hosting us and for being interested in our work. I really love what you do, and I wish you well too, and I look forward to further collaboration with you.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm really excited by the work that you're doing as well, and your energy that you all bring. So I'm excited to keep working together.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of part 1, and then